What's up everyone, my name is Marco, and today we're doing a quick side-by-side with the GoPro Hero4 Silver edition up against the new TomTom Bandit. Now I'm going to put these cameras through a variety of tests, so you can use any of these quick links to jump to the section you're most interested in. Otherwise, sit back and we'll start playing them all in just a second. Anyway, let's get to it. So we're going to start off by taking a look at both of these cameras at 2.7K. Now we're going to switch the resolutions around throughout the video. We're going to do 1920 by 1080p. We're going to look at 720p at 120 frames per second, and we're also going to change up the field of view on both of these cameras because it dramatically changes the quality of the footage when we swap from different resolutions and different field of views, and we're going to be calling that out all throughout this video. Now both of these cameras are filming with their latest firmware available at the time of filming this. With the Hero4 Silver, that's 3.0, which added a bunch of new ISO controls, and with the TomTom Bandit, that's its post-firmware launch of 1.408. So one of the good areas to start looking at both of these cameras is the lower left side of the screen on each of the images here. There's a ton of detail in the background and foreground information that we can just sort of digest and take a look at. Now with the GoPro Hero4 Silver, we do see a lot of detail in the tree. The grass that's up front is really sharp, and as we zoom into 200% here, this is really to kind of sort of emphasize some of the imperfections you'd see in each camera, and kind of both of them are on par, especially when we're looking at things in the distance. I feel the Hero4 Silver definitely gives us a little more sharpness on things that are up close. Now, one thing that was kind of surprising, we filmed the TomTom Bandit a lot at 2.7K, and it actually looks a lot better at 2.7K, but when we switch it over to 1080p here, it actually takes a big dive in quality. But the GoPro Hero 4 is kind of the opposite. When it's at 2.7K, it's nowhere near as sharp or as high crisp in quality as it is at 1920 at 1080p. So just to go over that as we flip through these back and forth right away, the Hero4 Silver is much more sharper at 1080p as opposed to 2.7K, while the TomTom Bandit offers a lot more quality at 2.7K as opposed to 1080p. Now the Bandit at 1080p looks a lot muddier and nowhere near as sharp in quality as it is at 2.7K. Now both of these cameras do come with field of view options. By default, both of them are in wide, which is a 170 degree field of view. The TomTom Bandit has two field of view options. We have wide and normal. Normal is pretty much our same as our medium field of view focus, while the GoPro Hero 4 also has the ability to do a narrow field of view focus, which is basically around 90 degrees. And while the TomTom Bandit does have a much sharper, clearer image at 2.7K wide field of view, switching that field of view to normal will make the image much softer and muddier, but we'll go into examples of that later. And while the argument could be made that the GoPro here does lose some of that same image quality when it goes to medium and narrow, it's nowhere near as extreme as it is with the TomTom Bandit, to the point where it's not even really worth mentioning because it's not super impactful. Now the Hero4 Silver is filming in ProTune throughout the duration of this video. ProTune will enable us to have a higher bitrate, and contrary to popular belief, it doesn't wash out your colors by default. Washing it out is actually you picking a certain color mode called flat, and what flat is really good for is doing post-production work and coloring your footage. Now we can apply just the normal GoPro color grade and still retain that higher bitrate data. But what's really good about filming in flat mode is that we can bring it into other editing software such as DaVinci's Resolve, like we're going to see here in a second, and we could really sort of tune in the values we want in our colors. So GoPro puts out GoPro Studio, which actually has a lot of color options. I'm just not as familiar with it as something like DaVinci Resolve here. So you can see we can sort of crunch those values in a similar fashion to be sort of the same as the default GoPro color grade, but then we can sort of change the highlights and tints to kind of give it that feel that we want for our video. I'm not the best colorist, but definitely if it's something you're looking to do, it's a very powerful option to have that the TomTom Bandit unfortunately does not have. Now both of these cameras share a very similar field of view. They're both filming at wide right now at 170 degrees, and they both basically share the same amount of distortion. We're not seeing anything really extreme as we reach the edge of the screen, similar to the Sony Action camera line of cameras. And when it comes to that rock detail in the back, there's a ton of detail there in the Hero4 Silver. Now as we switch to 1920 by 1080, you'll just see that quality improve in the Hero4 Silver, and as we swap back to 2.7K in the TomTom Bandit, you'll just see a lot of that detail just kind of come and go as we switch between the two. And even with the GoPro color grade on, we're still getting a ton of information and range in the reds in our car, while with the TomTom Bandit you see that red kind of get crunched, and it actually sort of changes a little bit in color as we switch between 2.7K and 1080p. So at the time of filming this, we were actually supposed to be mountain biking over at Snow Summit and Big Bear Lakes. Now what we originally wanted to do is test some of the GPS features on the TomTom Bandit, but it really turns out a lot of that will come into play more when the dedicated software comes out. Thanks to the efforts of San Bernardino Fire Department and CalFire, they were able to really push back these fires that were getting tremendously close to a bunch of houses and lodges. We were really close to a lot of these fires to the point where we had to be evacuated out of Snow Summit right as we got there. Unfortunately, we didn't really get to do mountain biking, but we did get a lot of access into being up close with helicopters, which I absolutely love. Like, these things were insane. This helicopter you see right here was just basically, it pushed out so much force and wind that if you didn't get down while standing on the dock, it would literally throw you off the dock. It was just tremendous, and we get a really good opportunity here to see a lot of different types of detail. So it's giving us a really unique opportunity to look at things of finer detail, sort of like mist hitting the water, the rudders impacting, and even things like water droplets hitting the lens. Now, if you're a surfer, or if you're doing motor vlogging, or just using this camera as sort of a dash cam, water droplets can be really important. And on the TomTom Bandit, they really get really bokeh'd and stay on the lens, while the Hero4 Silver, if there is enough wind, they do seem to blow off fairly nicely. Again, we have just a ton of detail here. Check out the hair detail on both of these cameras. The color profile is fairly similar on both of these in certain scenarios. The TomTom Bandit has a tendency to sort of bump up the saturation just a little bit more. If you look at that last shot, you'll have noticed the sky was a lot bluer, but the water was also kind of bluer. The Hero4 Silver was kind of showcasing a lot of that detail a little more accurately, but still not as pretty. The lake in general was more of a sort of muted color than it was a saturated blue. But, as we're walking through these log cabins here and looking at this street, all of the trees are coming off like really nicely saturated green. You'll see both of the cameras are kind of on par. It's just those areas where we have those really nice sort of open spaces that the color profile really starts to differ quite a bit. But for the most part, color profile-wise, they're fairly similar to each other, especially looking at this fire. Now with the Bandit, you can definitely see it's contrasting it a little more because we can kind of see those smoke clouds and those details in those trees just a little better, just because we're crunching those values. We're making those reds really visible in the clouds. Now as we zoom into 100% here, take a look at the tree line where the smoke is sort of coming up right in the front. There's just a ton of good detail on both of these cameras at 2.7K, but just remember, if we were at 1080p with the Hero4 Silver, we're actually going to see a big bump in sharpness. Now, a lot of people can get hung up on which camera has the best color profile, and the Hero4 Silver definitely does introduce a bit more red into its whites, but on its own, it's not something that's really going to bother you. It's really when we put these two cameras side by side that it can really kind of be kind of a detriment, because like right now the TomTom Bandit does feel a little more washed out than the GoPro Hero4 Silver, but earlier when we were looking at those side by side by the lake, the TomTom Bandit definitely looked like it had a lot more saturation than the Hero4 Silver. So clarity and sort of detail is a little more important to me than color, unless the color starts to seem very oddly off. Now in this area where the fire was only blocks away from houses, take a look at things like the street sign on the left side of the road, or even that big pine tree right on the left. Look at the TomTom's clarity when we're on that normal field of view. It's definitely much softer than it is at wide field of view, and when we switch out here to 2.7K at wide field of view, take a look at things like the bricks in the lower left, that street sign. The Hero4 Silver is definitely really good at focusing on things that are closer to the camera, but even these bricks are still quite a few feet off from where we're filming. But there's a lot more, there's much sharper edges, there's a little more clarity in those bricks, and same things like with the street sign and the big pine tree, we're just able to see a lot more clarity. And thanks to droughts in California, I'm standing what used to be about 20 feet into Big Bear Lakes. Now in this next section, we're going to take a look at time lapses, and generally what I would have you look at is things like white balance changes or color changes, but both of those hold up pretty well. The TomTom Bandit is filming in a video time-lapse mode that can do either 1080p or 4K, but it doesn't do photo, while the GoPro Hero4 Silver will actually do its time lapses in photos if you want, but it also has the built-in feature to build it as a video for you if you want, but you can do photos at that same 4000 by 3000 resolution images with all of the color options that you would want from sort of raw photography. Both of these cameras also have the ability to film at 120 frames per second at 720p. Now with the TomTom Bandit you can switch it to do 240 frames a second, but it doesn't actually tell you, it just says it's 6 times slower. And the same with the Hero4 Silver, we could do 240 frames a second if we want to go into 480p, but if you want to stay in the HD ballpark, 720p is where it's at. Now the TomTom Bandit, unfortunately in this one shot in particular, is in a medium field of view by accident, while the Hero4 Silver is set to wide, but again, look at the detail in the moss on the ground. The Hero4 Silver in wide and medium, it doesn't really impact the quality in terms of clarity and detail. The TomTom Bandit, unfortunately, just much of that moss on the ground looks very soft. Even with the YouTube compression, it should be fairly noticeable. Here we're looking at things like the mist quality coming up from the ground, the color profile we can sort of start to take a look at, but I'm just seeing a lot more detail in the GoPro Hero 4 Silver through that mist cloud on the left, but the TomTom Bandit isn't too far off, but both of these cameras do, I guess now's a good time to mention that both of these cameras actually do retail for the same price. They're both $399 at launch, and the Hero 4 Silver is coming towards the time when it might see a price cut, because it's been out for almost a year now, and every September, the GoPro Hero 4 line of cameras usually announces a new camera, so in theory, the TomTom Bandit might be a little high in price as opposed to the Hero 4 Silver, but it really depends on what type of features you're looking for. Again, we're here at 2.7K, really beautiful shot here. The Bandit has a tendency right now to go a little more green in this shot, but it's really pumping up those blues quite a bit, and the green might be just the saturation just sort of pumping up and sort of cooling off the image a little bit. The Hero 4 Silver tends to be a little more balanced, and if we wanted to bump up that saturation in post using GoPro Studio or Adobe Premiere later, it would be super easy and look super good. The Hero 4 Silver here just again saying slightly more on the neutral scale, while the TomTom Bandit is taking a lot of that sort of color information and just sort of increasing it ever so slightly just so it's a little more appealing. Hero 4 Silver, also the sun is blooming out a little more, while the TomTom Bandit makes it a nice little perfect circle in the sky. Again, look at detail in those ridge lines in the distance. Same with this shot here. As we're kind of going into the low light section, things like how the sun is setting and how much detail we have in our shadow areas is going to be really important to pay attention to. Now the Hero 4 Silver is still continuing to give us a really nice bright image. There's a lot of clarity, a lot of detail in the building information. We're still filming at 2.7K, but now the Bandit seems to be a little softer, especially in that red building right in front. Now, areas like that sort of pavement on the lower left, we definitely have a little more clarity and detail in the Hero 4 Silver, but again, as we go into the low light, the Bandit sort of has a little harder time bringing out some of that information, where before with 2.7K, we didn't really have that problem so much. And as we move into lower light with the TomTom Bandit, I am noticing a little more chromatic aberration like that white box in the lower left and a bunch of dancing green, especially underneath the car in the next section. Anyway guys, right now we're going to be doing a sound test between these two cameras, so we're going to play some music here and we're also going to use the sound of my voice just to determine how the quality is between these two cameras, so let's get to it. You didn't close the door, left the crack open, I couldn't ignore the fact possibility of having hope in this insanity that we still could be, but we're stopped to see me. Earlier in the video I mentioned that we're filming with the firmware 3.0 on the Hero 4 Silver. This is a really new firmware and it adds some really big ISO updates. So now we have the ability to film at ISO 3200, which is great. It's a great in-between of 6400 and 1600, and for me this has become my new sort of ideal setup when filming in low light conditions with the Hero 4 Silver. The Bandit doesn't have any type of low light control. We're basically just sticking around here at 6400. Now you can basically see when both are at 6400, they both have a very similar dancing green issue. The only real difference is the TomTom Bandit has a tendency to go more on the green side in this image, but again, we could just sort of counteract that color, but I feel like the Hero 4 Silver is a little more accurate with its sort of color profile at night. The Hero 4 actually used to be really bad at turning things green in the dark, so it seems like the latest firmware update has sort of helped fix that without me having to do any sort of complicated fixes. Now we can change the ISO to 1600 as well. It will remove a lot of that dancing green, but it's going to bring down that image quality a little darker because adjusting the ISO is actually artificially boosting every pixel, and that's what makes a lot of that dancing green very visible. It's just we're basically artificially boosting those green patterns. Now the Hero 4 does offer a bunch more ISO options, but we're generally sticking with the more popular ones, but you could go down to 400 or 800 if you wanted to. Now actually when it comes to low light photos, the GoPro Hero 4 Silver has a photography mode that's called Night-lapse or night mode, where we can actually adjust the shutter speed to be what we want, and we can start it all the way from automatic to half a second to 1 second, and we can actually jump all the way up to 30 seconds for night photography and night time lapses. The only downside is our ISO is limited to 800, but generally in most cases that's going to be more than enough for what you need, except for maybe some stargazing. And lastly, what we have on screen here is our image quality side by side. Now the GoPro Hero4 Silver, as you might know, is using a 12 megapixel image sensor at a resolution of 4000 by 3000. It does spectacular image quality, and it has a ton of options, and the LCD screen on the back of that camera makes filming with still photography in mind very useful, especially in low light conditions. The TomTom Bandit is actually boosting a very impressive 16 megapixel image sensor at a resolution of 4656 by 3492. Now I know what you're saying, Mark, both of these are 4:3 aspect ratio photos, but I need square photos for Instagram. Well, I'm here to tell you today that Instagram no longer has cropped images. I know, you can have uncropped images all you want, and it's spectacular. You can actually download all the images here you've seen yourself in the more information section below this video and get a real look at the quality differences between these two cameras. As you can see on screen here, we're doing the shutter speed differences on the Hero4 Silver itself. But again, go to the more information section below this video, take a look at the image quality differences for yourself between these two cameras, because a lot of what you see in the photo quality differences translates into the video stuff on top of everything you've already seen and listened to me talk about for the last 15 minutes here. Anyway, that's going to wrap up our side-by-side of the TomTom Bandit up against the GoPro Hero4 Silver. But before you leave, you could hit that like and subscribe button. Definitely helps boost my morale. And if you want, sharing this video is actually a huge help to me in many ways. It actually helps get my video out there and higher in the ratings. More than anything else, if you could share this video with your friends, that would be great. If you're feeling super generous, we also have a Patreon page. You can be our donator number 3, and maybe we'll get over $2 by the end of this month, because all of Mark Hawk Cam is run out of my pocket, and yeah, it would just help boost my morale and help keep the lights on here and doing what we do. We're going to have a ton more side-by-sides coming out right down the road as we go into the holiday season. There's just a ton we're backlogged on as camera manufacturers throw cameras at us left and right. We're going to have more coverage on the Hero4 Session, on the Yi, on the Garmin Verb. There's just a ton more cameras, including the TomTom Bandit. We still have a lot more to go over with that, so be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It's definitely a huge help to me, and one last shout out to San Bernardino Fire Department and CalFir for all the tremendous work they did up at Big Bear Mountain. So anyway, I'm Mark Hawk, and I'll see you all out there. Have a good one, everyone.